A large Resveratrol review was just published, where it combined the best available data, and it concluded that resveratrol has a dramatic impact on regulating lipid and glucose metabolism, which sounds great, but on this channel we don't just look at abstracts and conclusions. We need to have a deeper dive into this paper to see if it stacks up and if it gives me a reason to prescribe resveratrol to my patients. Let's get into it. So the paper was published on the 31st of March this year, and it's titled The Efficacy of Resveratrol Supplementation on Glucose and Lipid Metabolism, a meta-analysis and systematic review. So again, this is just combining the best available data to see what it shows. And the authors did this review because the research on resveratrol supplementation, it still remains controversial. What they did is trawl through all of the databases, and they were looking for randomized controlled trials in humans. In particular, they wanted to make sure that it did include resveratrol, and it compared resveratrol directly to a placebo. So hopefully that way we're only including quality studies, and I really like this start. And the papers included must have measured biological risk markers, such as total cholesterol, body weight index, waist circumference, and HbA1c. So HbA1c is the marker that I'm particularly interested in. This is the marker that I use for my type 2 diabetics. After their search, the authors found 25 placebo-controlled, randomized controlled studies that they were going to combine. This data included a total of 1,171 participants, including 578 in the placebo group and 593 in the intervention group. So roughly the same numbers, and again, this is a fantastic start to this analysis. We then need to assess the quality of these papers. So the quality and bias of all of the eligible studies, they were assessed using the Cochrane Collaboration Risk of Bias tool. Unfortunately, the findings indicated that only 8 studies had low risk of bias, 19 studies had unclear bias risk, and 9 studies had high bias risk. So overall, there's only 8 out of the 25 studies that are rigorously sound, that we can actually rely on the data produced from those studies. 17 of those studies we can't be sure about. And that is a massive red flag. There is a saying, garbage in, garbage out. So if we don't have robust data to plug into this meta-analysis, then the conclusions can be flawed. But let's move to the results of this paper. So it found that there were significant decreases following resveratrol administration on waist circumference, and these are statistically significant. HbA1c, which again is the marker that I'm particularly interested in, and total cholesterol, as well as LDL cholesterol. Meanwhile, we found that resveratrol had no significant effect on body weight index, fasting glucose, insulin, or the HOMA index, which is an index that measures insulin resistance. So those are interesting findings, but let's have a peek under the hood. The authors found that the heterogeneity was significantly high. So this just means that the trials, they're showing different results. So some trials, they do show a positive effect of resveratrol supplements, and other trials don't. This is a problem because ideally what we want to see is most of the trials showing a trend towards improvement. Then a meta-analysis like this really steps into its own because it can combine that data and it can give a statistically significant result. It can be very difficult though if the trials are showing different outcomes. So if one trial is showing a positive result and another trial is showing a negative result, if you combine the two together, how do you know which one to listen to? Let's take waist circumference for example. When the authors looked at the data, it was suggesting that resveratrol supplements can reduce waist circumference. But when we have a look at the underlying data, we can see that there are 4 studies that are showing not much benefit, and one trial is actually showing a trend towards worsening waist circumference. Then we've got 3 trials that are showing positive effects with resveratrol on waist circumference. So when you combine it, yes, it does look like resveratrol supplements might improve waist circumference, but this is confusing. 4 of the trials showed no effect of resveratrol supplements on waist circumference. In a perfect world, we'd want to see that most of the studies were showing a trend towards improvement. Again, that is where an analysis like this really comes into its own, where we can combine that data and come up with a statistically significant result. But instead, what we're seeing here is a hodgepodge of data, and when we combine that data, it can lead us down dangerous paths, because we can lead to the wrong conclusion. And the most likely reason for seeing this heterogeneity, which again is differences in the outcome results of the individual trials, is because of poor methodology. And that comes back to that original red flag that I brought up with you. Only 8 of the 25 studies included in this analysis are robust. It's the exact same story when we look at HbA1c. So the authors, when they combined the data, it showed a statistically significant improvement with resveratrol supplements. But most of the trials here, there's no difference. There is no improvement in the HbA1c. There's only a couple of the trials that are showing an improvement, and it's those 3 trials that seem to skew the overall analysis. So we have to tread extremely carefully when we're combining that data together. And just to drive this point home that the underlying data is skewed, that some of the data shows a positive effect and others don't, we can have a look at LDL cholesterol. It's a hodgepodge here. There are some trials that are showing a positive effect, whereas other trials are actually showing that resveratrol worsens LDL cholesterol. So a highly heterogeneous data set. And again, when we're combining that data together, it can lead us down the wrong path. And to round things off, there was a possible publication bias that was detected for the waist circumference studies, as well as the HbA1c and total cholesterol studies. Overall then, we've got some serious red flags with this analysis. Only 8 of the underlying 25 studies were of low risk of bias. The remaining 17 were either unclear risk or high risk of bias. And because of that underlying bias, the results of the studies show wildly conflicting results. And that's what we mean by high heterogeneity. Again, in a perfect world, we want to see that most of the studies are showing a trend towards improvement. And that's where an analysis like this can really come into its own, where it can combine that good data together to come up with a statistically significant result. But that's not what this analysis does. Instead, it's combining a hodgepodge mess of data and coming to a conclusion. So if we read the conclusion of this analysis, it says, taken together, these results suggest that resveratrol has a dramatic impact on regulating lipid and glucose metabolism, and the major clinical value of resveratrol intake is for obese and diabetic patients. The efficacy of resveratrol supplementation in lipid metabolism was clarified in these results of the systematic review. We hope that this study could provide more options for clinicians using resveratrol. Now, I completely disagree with that conclusion. Instead, I think the conclusion should read something like this. Many of the resveratrol human studies have an unclear bias risk or a high bias risk. When we look at the data, it is highly heterogeneous, meaning that some of the trials show a benefit and others don't, and this is likely because of that underlying bias. When we combine this heterogeneous data, it suggests that resveratrol may improve waist circumference, HbA1c, and LDL cholesterol. We cannot be certain about these findings. That statement far more accurately represents the overall findings from this analysis. And I find it difficult to know where to go from here. So over the past 2 decades, literally billions of dollars have been spent on resveratrol research, and still to this day, we don't have any robust data showing us that there are benefits of resveratrol supplements. From this meta-analysis, for me it doesn't give justification that I should be prescribing resveratrol to my type 2 diabetic or obese patients. We've got better treatment options. We can improve their diet, exercise, and then we can use medications such as metformin, SGLT2 inhibitors, and GLP-1 agonists. And when we have a look at the creme de la creme of clinical guidelines called Up to Date, resveratrol is listed as a supplement that they do not recommend. So it says that although lipid lowering with resveratrol supplements have been described in experimental models, the evidence is less conclusive in randomized human trials. For me, this study is a powerful reminder that we can't just go on what a study abstract or conclusion says. We need to have a deep dive into the data to see how those authors are actually reaching that conclusion. So please let me know in the comment section, what did you think about this paper? And are you going to use resveratrol supplements or not? A massive thank you to all of the patrons who support the channel, and if you haven't already, please check out my clinical trial fundraiser for rapamycin. Until next time, thanks very much.